The day Clarence Whitmore walked out of the office, after 36 years of service, the box in his hands held almost nothing at all. A few worn notebooks, a photograph of his family, taken on a summer afternoon 2 decades earlier, and the small employee badge that had once let him into every floor of the building before dawn. Victoria Hale, the new chief executive officer of Sterling Crest Property Group, watched him from behind her glass desk and told him that Sterling Crest needed people who built the future, not people who guarded the past. Clarence did not argue. He set the key to the filing cabinets on the corner of her desk, looked at her for a long moment, and said that he hoped, when the board eventually asked about the decisions made over the last 30 years, someone would still remember where to look. 3 weeks later, it was the board itself that demanded his entire records be pulled from storage and laid out on the table. Sometimes the person let go first turns out to be the person who understood the organization best of anyone in the building, and nobody in that boardroom yet understood how true that would become. Sterling Crest Property Group occupied the top 4 floors of a granite tower in downtown Chicago, and from those floors it managed dozens of luxury residential buildings, corporate office complexes, and mixed-use developments spread across 3 states. Thousands of tenants signed leases through its offices every year, and hundreds of contracts moved through its systems at any given time, contracts written by different lawyers in different decades. Contracts shaped by negotiations that had happened long before most of the current staff had been hired. It was a company built on relationships as much as real estate, on trust accumulated slowly through hundreds of small decisions made correctly over a very long stretch of years, and somewhere near the center of that slow accumulation sat a man named Clarence Whitmore, 74 years old, who had spent 36 of those years as the senior office manager. Though the title never came close to describing what he actually did for the company, the offices themselves reflected the company's long, layered history in small, unremarkable ways that most employees walked past without ever noticing. A particular hallway on the 3rd floor, still bent at an odd angle because it had been built around a load-bearing wall from the original 1970s, structure the company had renovated rather than demolished. A conference room on the top floor still carried the name of a founding partner who had died more than 20 years earlier, a small act of memory nobody had ever thought to update. The company's standard lease template still included a clause about snow removal responsibilities that dated back to a lawsuit filed during a particularly brutal winter decades before most current employees had been born, and almost nobody left in the building could explain why the clause existed anymore, except for Clarence, who could recite the entire history of that lawsuit from memory, the way another person might recite a favorite recipe. These small, half-forgotten fragments of the company's past were scattered everywhere throughout Sterling Crest, quiet reminders that the organization was not simply a collection of current employees and current software, but the accumulated residue of every decision, every mistake, and every hard-won lesson that had come before them. Clarence had started at Sterling Crest as an administrative assistant, back when the company owned only 6 buildings and operated out of 2 rented floors in a much smaller structure near the river. He had been 28 years old then, recently discharged from a stint managing supply logistics for a manufacturing plant on the south side, and he had walked into Sterling Crest with nothing more than a steady hand for paperwork and an instinct for noticing when something did not add up. Over the decades that followed, he built his reputation one small act of diligence at a time, catching an error in a lease renewal before it became a lawsuit, remembering which building superintendent could be trusted and which could not, keeping a private ledger of promises made to difficult tenants so that nobody would ever have to relearn a lesson the company had already paid to learn once. He never sat on the executive floor, and he never appeared on an organizational chart above the middle rungs, and he was never invited to the strategy retreats where the company's future got decided in conference rooms, with expensive coffee and city views, a fact that had never particularly troubled him, since he had always measured his own worth less by the size of the room he was allowed into, and more by whether the people around him could sleep easier at night, knowing a difficult problem had already been quietly handled. Yet every department in the building, at one point or another, found itself walking down the hallway to his modest corner office. Because Clarence Whitmore always had an answer. Clarence had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the second of 4 children, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings downtown at night, and a father who drove a delivery truck for a bakery that no longer existed. He had learned, early and without ever needing anyone to explain it to him, that steady worked, carefully, was the surest path available to a young black man from his neighborhood who wanted something more stable than what the world seemed willing to hand him, and that lesson had settled into him so deeply that it shaped nearly every choice he made for the rest of his life. He married young, raised 2 children of his own in a modest brick house, not far from where he had grown up, and the photograph he kept in his desk drawer for 36 years, the same photograph that eventually made its way into the cardboard box on the day he left, showed the 4 of them standing together on a porch. One summer afternoon, his wife laughing at something just outside the frame, his children still small enough to be held. He had never needed recognition to feel that his work mattered. It had always been enough to him that the people who depended on him could depend on him completely. A young leasing agent, struggling with an unusually hostile tenant, would knock on his door and leave 20 minutes later with a plan that actually worked because Clarence remembered a similar tenant from 1998 and knew exactly which tone diffused the situation and which tone made it worse. A newly promoted property manager, baffled by a strange clause buried in an old maintenance contract, would bring the document to Clarence and learn that the clause existed because a boiler had failed catastrophically in the winter of 2003, flooding 4 floors of a residential building and nearly costing the company its largest client, and the clause had been written afterward so that failure could never happen the same way twice. A department head preparing a presentation for the board would sometimes quietly ask Clarence to confirm the history behind a 15-year-old decision because the official records were incomplete and Clarence's memory, somehow, never was. He answered every one of these questions patiently, without condescension, without ever making the younger employees feel foolish for not already knowing what he knew, and for a long time that quiet reliability was simply understood as part of the architecture of the building, as fixed and unremarkable as the elevators or the lobby marble. But architecture, however load-bearing, tends to become invisible to the people who walk past it every day. And somewhere in the last several years of his tenure, a shift began to take place in how the younger staff perceived him. They did not dislike Clarence. Many of them genuinely liked him, found him kind, found his stories interesting, in the way a grandfather's stories are interesting at a holiday dinner. But liking someone and valuing someone are not always the same thing, and increasingly the newer hires, many of them fluent in software, Clarence had never learned and comfortable with a pace of communication built around instant messages and dashboards rather than conversations and paper trails, began to see him as a relic of an earlier era of the company, a kind, careful man who belonged to a version of Sterling Crest that already ended, even if nobody had officially announced its ending. They respected his tenure, the way one respects an old photograph on the wall, admiring it without quite believing it had anything to teach them about the present, and that quiet condescension, invisible and unspoken, was already gathering in the building's atmosphere long before Victoria Hale ever walked through its doors. There was a particular afternoon, not long before Victoria's arrival, that later came to feel like a small, quiet warning nobody had bothered to heed. A junior attorney fresh out of law school had been assigned to review a decades-old ground lease for a property the company was considering redeveloping, and she came to Clarence frustrated, convinced the document contained a drafting error, a clause that seemed to grant the ground tenant rights that made no logical sense under current market practice. Clarence read the clause slowly, then explained that the language had been written deliberately during a period in the late 1980s when the company had nearly lost the property entirely in a dispute with a previous owner, and that the unusual clause had been the price of keeping the lease at all. A concession accepted so the company could survive a moment that would otherwise have ended very badly. The attorney left his office that day with a different understanding, not just of the document, but of the company itself, and she mentioned to a colleague afterward, almost in passing, That talking to Clarence felt less like consulting an employee and more like consulting a living archive, one that happened to also make excellent coffee and remember everyone's birthday. Victoria arrived at Sterling Crest Property Group on a cold morning in early spring, hired by a board of directors that had grown anxious about the company's trajectory. Sterling Crest's growth had slowed considerably over the previous 5 years, its once impressive margins eroded by rising costs, by competitors using far more sophisticated software to manage occupancy and maintenance, and by a market that increasingly expected instant digital transparency from property managers rather than phone calls and paper leases. Victoria had spent the previous decade building a reputation as a turnaround specialist in the technology sector, credited with modernizing 2 mid-sized software companies and steering a struggling logistics firm back into profitability through aggressive digitization and organizational restructuring. She was 42 years old, sharp-minded, articulate, and genuinely talented, and the board believed, not unreasonably, that her outside perspective was exactly what a company as set in its ways as Sterling Crest desperately needed. She did not arrive at Sterling Crest looking to hurt anyone. She arrived believing, with real conviction, that an organization too comfortable with its own history eventually loses the ability to see its own blind spots, and she intended to drag Sterling Crest, gently if possible but firmly if necessary, into a future that could actually compete. Within her first month, Victoria assembled the leadership team and laid out a sweeping strategy that would, over the following year, reshape nearly every operational process the company used. All physical records would be digitized and migrated into a centralized cloud-based management system. Redundant approval chains, many of them built up over decades of accumulated caution, would be streamlined or eliminated entirely. New artificial intelligence-powered software would handle scheduling, maintenance tracking, tenant communication, and financial forecasting, reducing the need for the layers of human oversight the company had always relied upon, and significant portions of the longtime staff, particularly those in administrative and coordination roles that Victoria considered ripe for automation, would be restructured out of the organization in favor of leaner, more technically fluent teams. The younger employees in the room, many of whom had felt for years that the company was falling behind its competitors, received the plan with visible enthusiasm, nodding along as Victoria described dashboards that would replace filing cabinets and algorithms that would replace institutional memory. Clarence did not object to any of it, at least not in the way people expected him to. He sat quietly through the presentation, took a few notes in the small notebook he always carried, and when Victoria finally asked if anyone had concerns, he raised his hand and spoke calmly. Without drama, the way he had spoken to difficult tenants and nervous new hires for 36 years. He told her that he was not opposed to change, that he had watched the company change many times over the decades and had never once tried to stop it, but that not everything old was useless, simply because it was old, and that many of the processes she was preparing to eliminate had come into existence because the company had once paid a very real price to learn the lesson. Those processes now protected against. Victoria listened politely, thanked him for his input, and moved on to the next slide. And in the weeks that followed, as the digitization project accelerated, she came to interpret his caution not as wisdom but as a kind of institutional inertia, a comfortable man defending his own familiar routines under the guise of concern for the company. Their disagreement crystallized one afternoon in a leadership meeting, when Victoria, growing visibly frustrated with the pace of the transition, told the room that the company could not continue to grow by relying on the memory of one man, no matter how dedicated that man had been. Clarence, sitting near the back of the room as he always did, answered without raising his voice, agreeing that she was right, that no company should ever depend entirely on a single person's memory, but adding that a company also could not grow by forgetting the very things that had once allowed it to survive. Victoria studied him for a moment, said nothing further on the subject that day, and privately began to view him as the clearest symbol of everything about Sterling Crest that needed to change. A man whose loyalty she respected in the abstract, but whose presence, in her judgment, represented exactly the kind of comfortable stagnation the board had hired her to eliminate. Later that same week, Alone in her office after most of the staff had gone home, Victoria found herself thinking back on the technology companies she had helped transform earlier in her career, organizations built from the ground up around speed and iteration, where the average employee had been younger than Clarence's own children, and where nobody had ever once suggested that a filing cabinet somewhere held wisdom a database could not replicate. She had built her entire professional identity on the belief that organizations cling to the familiar. Not because the familiar is wise, but because change is frightening, and that the leader's job is to push through that fear on everyone's behalf, even when it makes her unpopular in the short term. It did not occur to her, not yet, that a property management company, built on decades of human relationships and long memory, might operate according to a different logic than a software startup, built on rapid iteration, and that the caution she had learned to distrust in other contexts might, in this particular building, be pointing at something real. She closed her laptop that night, more convinced than ever that her plan was correct, and more certain than ever that Clarence Whitmore, however well-meaning, belonged to a version of the company she had been hired specifically to leave behind. The decision, when it finally came, arrived with the quiet efficiency of a company trying to modernize itself as painlessly as possible. Victoria determined that the traditional office manager position, with its broad, loosely defined authority, built up organically over decades, no longer fit the leaner operational structure she envisioned for Sterling Crest, and she proposed replacing it with a newly created role. An operations coordinator, younger, more technically fluent, comfortable navigating the new software from the very first day, rather than needing months of retraining. The board approved the restructuring with little debate, trusting the judgment of the executive they had specifically hired to make exactly this kind of difficult call, and on a gray Tuesday morning in early autumn, Victoria asked Clarence to come to her office. She told him, once he had taken a seat across from her desk, that she respected everything he had done for the company over the years, that his dedication was not in question and never had been, but that Sterling Crest needed a different direction moving forward, one built around speed and technical fluency rather than institutional memory. Clarence listened without interrupting, his hands folded calmly in his lap, and when she finished, he simply said that he understood. Victoria seemed almost thrown by the lack of resistance, and she asked him, somewhat hesitantly, whether he did not want to fight the decision, whether he had nothing more to say in his own defense. Clarence shook his head slowly and told her that he had no interest in fighting, that he only wanted to make certain the person who came after him understood exactly what they were holding, because some of what he carried was not written down anywhere else in the building. Victoria thanked him again, told him the company would prepare a generous severance package in recognition of his years of service, and the meeting ended within a few short minutes, the entire conversation quieter and more polite than either of them had expected. Word moved through the office quickly that afternoon, the way it always does in a building full of people who have worked alongside one another for years. Many of his longtime colleagues were genuinely saddened, some visibly so, stopping by his desk throughout the day to shake his hand or offer an awkward, heartfelt word of thanks for something he had helped them through years earlier. But almost nobody objected out loud, not to Victoria, not to the board, not even quietly among themselves, in the way people sometimes voice private doubts about decisions they consider unjust. Some of the newer staff, watching Clarence pack his few belongings into a cardboard box that had once held printer paper, felt a small, uneasy pang of guilt they could not quite name, while others genuinely believed, without any real malice, that his departure marked the beginning of something better for the company, a necessary and overdue passing of the torch to a generation more comfortable with the tools the future would clearly demand. Nobody in that building, on that particular gray Tuesday, understood how quickly the comfortable assumptions behind that belief would begin to unravel. Clarence rode the elevator down to the lobby alone that afternoon, the cardboard box balanced against his hip, and stepped out onto a street he had walked at the beginning and end of nearly every workday for 36 years. He did not feel humiliated, though he understood why someone watching might have expected him to. What he felt mostly was a kind of tired clarity, the recognition that he had given the company everything he reasonably could, and that the manner of his leaving, however abrupt, did not erase a single one of the years that had come before it. He called his wife from the sidewalk to tell her the news before she heard it from anyone else. And when she asked if he was angry, he told her, honestly, that he was not, only a little sad. The way a person feels sad watching a house they built get sold to someone who plans to tear down a wall without first asking why it was ever put there. That night, at the kitchen table where he had eaten dinner with his family for decades, he opened one of his old notebooks out of habit, more from restlessness than any real intention, and sat for a long while simply looking at his own handwriting, 36 years of it, wondering, for the first time in a long time, whether any of it would ever matter to anyone again. For the first several weeks after Clarence left, the new systems performed exactly as promised, and Victoria felt a quiet, well-earned satisfaction as she watched the transition unfold. Reports that once took days to compile now appeared within hours, generated automatically by software that pulled data directly from digitized files. Meetings grew shorter, freed from the long historical asides that had once characterized so many of Clarence's contributions. The new operations coordinator, a capable young woman named Danielle Reyes, moved through the software with impressive fluency. And for a brief, encouraging stretch of time, it genuinely seemed as though Victoria's vision for a leaner, faster, more modern Sterling Crest was working precisely as intended. The first crack appeared almost by accident, in the form of a phone call from one of the company's longest-standing commercial tenants, a manufacturing firm that had leased warehouse space from Sterling Crest for nearly 2 decades. The tenant's owner called, demanding to know why his company had suddenly been billed for a maintenance surcharge his lease, he insisted, had never included. Danielle pulled up the digitized contract and found nothing indicating any exception, and when she explained this politely to the tenant, he grew increasingly agitated, insisting that a verbal agreement had been reached years earlier with a since-retired property manager, an agreement that had quietly exempted his company from certain maintenance costs, in exchange for signing an unusually long lease term during a difficult period for the company. The digitized files showed no trace of any such arrangement, because the arrangement had never existed as a formal amendment, only as a handwritten note in a private ledger Clarence had kept for exactly this kind of situation. A note that had never made it into any system anyone thought to scan. The tenant threatened legal action, and though the dispute was eventually resolved through negotiation, it left Danielle rattled and left Victoria quietly troubled in a way she did not yet fully understand. The second crack was more serious. Sterling Crest had recently begun development on a mixed-use property on the city's near west side, a project involving considerable regulatory complexity and a web of easement agreements with neighboring landowners. During a routine compliance review, the legal team discovered that a critical environmental disclosure document, one required to finalize a zoning variance, appeared to be missing from the digitized file entirely. Nobody could determine whether the document had ever existed, whether it had simply been lost during the digitization process, or whether an entire step of the original approval process had somehow been skipped years earlier. The uncertainty alone was enough to threaten a costly delay, and for several tense days, the legal team scrambled through incomplete records, trying to reconstruct a paper trail that no longer fully existed, unable to find anyone still employed at the company who remembered the specific details of an approval process, finalized nearly a decade earlier. The third crack struck closer to home, and it struck a person rather than a project. A payroll discrepancy surfaced involving a maintenance supervisor who had worked for Sterling Crest for over 20 years, a quiet, dependable man named Harold Jennings who had never once, in 2 decades, filed a complaint or raised his voice in a meeting. The new automated payroll system flagged an irregularity in his historical compensation records, an irregularity that appeared, on the surface, to suggest he had been overpaid for years due to a clerical error. Before anyone thought to investigate further, Harold was quietly pulled into an uncomfortable meeting with human resources, informed that the company intended to recover the overpayment from his future wages, and sent back to his desk humiliated and confused, uncertain what he had done wrong, after 20 years of steady, uncomplaining work. The truth, though nobody at Sterling Crest yet realized it, was that Harold's compensation had been intentionally adjusted years earlier, following a workplace injury he sustained while responding to an emergency after hours, a private arrangement negotiated quietly by Clarence to ensure Harold was fairly compensated for the additional risk, without drawing attention that might have embarrassed a man who valued his privacy above almost everything else. The digitized records showed only a number that did not match the formula, with no explanation attached, because the explanation had never lived anywhere, except in the memory of the man who negotiated it. A fourth incident followed within days, smaller in scale but sharper in its embarrassment. And it involved a long-term residential tenant, an elderly widow, who had lived in one of the company's buildings for nearly 30 years, and who had, according to the new automated leasing system, fallen behind on her rent by an amount significant enough to trigger an automatic eviction notice. Danielle, following the process exactly as the software directed, allowed the notice to be issued before anyone thought to question it, and only after the tenant's daughter called the office in tears, describing a mother who had never missed a single payment in 3 decades, did anyone discover that the woman's unit had been granted a small permanent rent adjustment years earlier, arranged quietly after a fire in an adjacent unit had damaged part of her apartment and displaced her for 2 months, a gesture of basic decency that had never been formally coded into any lease amendment, because the man who arranged it had never imagined a machine would someday need it spelled out in a language it could understand. The eviction notice was rescinded within a day, and the company issued a private apology. But word of the incident spread quietly among the building's other longtime residents, and for the first time since Victoria's arrival, a small current of real distrust began moving through the tenant base itself, not merely the internal staff. Victoria began to notice a pattern forming beneath these individual incidents, and the pattern troubled her more than any single failure could have on its own. It was not that the new software was malfunctioning, exactly. The systems performed precisely as designed, processing data quickly and accurately, according to the information they had been given. The problem, as Victoria slowly and reluctantly began to understand, was that the data itself was incomplete, stripped of the context, the history, and the human judgment that had once surrounded it, context that had never been written down anywhere because it had always lived, quietly and reliably, inside the memory of a man the company no longer employed. Sterling Crest had not simply digitized its records. It had, without quite meaning to, erased the reasoning behind decades of decisions, keeping the conclusions while discarding everything that explained why those conclusions had once made sense. The crisis that finally forced the issue into the open began with the company's largest client, a real estate investment trust that leased office space across 4 Sterling Crest properties, and represented, by a considerable margin, the single largest source of the company's annual revenue. A dispute arose over responsibility for structural repairs following water damage in one of the leased buildings, a dispute that hinged entirely on the precise language of an amendment negotiated more than 12 years earlier. An amendment that existed in the digitized system only as a vague, incomplete summary, lacking the specific engineering assessments and negotiated concessions that had originally accompanied it. The client's legal team grew increasingly impatient, hinting strongly that continued ambiguity around the company's record-keeping might lead them to reconsider their entire relationship with Sterling Crest. When their master lease came up for renewal the following year, a relationship worth tens of millions of dollars annually. Word of the threat reached the board of directors within days, and the board, alarmed at the prospect of losing its most important client over what appeared to be a basic failure of institutional record-keeping, demanded an immediate and thorough review of the company's entire operational history. The board convened an emergency meeting, and it was in that meeting, surrounded by binders full of incomplete digital summaries and increasingly anxious executives, that one of the longest-serving board members finally asked the question. Nobody else in the room seemed able to answer. He asked, simply, who at Sterling Crest had traditionally been responsible for preserving the reasoning and context behind the company's major operational decisions, who had kept track of the agreements, the exceptions, and the lessons the company had learned the hard way over the decades. The room fell silent. Victoria, seated at the head of the table, found herself unable to offer a satisfying answer, because the honest answer, she was beginning to realize, with a slow and uncomfortable dread, was a man she had removed from the company a little over a year earlier. It was a longtime property manager, seated quietly near the back of the room, who finally spoke the name aloud, saying simply that Clarence Whitmore had always been the one who remembered everything, the one people had gone to for 36 years. Whenever a question could not be answered by looking at a screen. The board member who had first raised the question turned toward Victoria and asked, without any real hostility but with unmistakable seriousness, whether the company still had access to Clarence's records, whatever form they might take. Victoria, caught somewhere between professional composure and a rising sense of alarm, promised the board that she would locate whatever materials remained and have them reviewed immediately, privately assuming, without much confidence, that whatever they found would amount to little more than a collection of disorganized personal notes, useful perhaps as anecdotal color, but unlikely to resolve a genuine legal and financial crisis. Another board member, an older gentleman who had sat on Sterling Crest's board since before Victoria was hired, and who had known Clarence casually for years, pressed the point further, asking Victoria directly whether the decision to eliminate his position had ever accounted for the possibility that some of what he carried existed nowhere else. Victoria, to her credit, did not deflect the question, admitting plainly that the restructuring plan had treated his role primarily as an administrative function that newer software could replicate and that nobody on the leadership team, herself included, had conducted any real assessment of what unique historical knowledge might be lost in the transition. The admission landed heavily in the room, not because anyone intended to blame her personally, but because it confirmed what several people at the table had quietly begun to suspect over the preceding weeks, that the company's crisis was not a matter of bad luck or an unfortunate coincidence of timing, but the direct and foreseeable consequence of a decision made too quickly by people who had not fully understood what they were deciding. What the review team eventually found, tucked away in a storage unit the company had nearly forgotten it still paid rent on, was nothing like what anyone had expected. It was not a chaotic pile of aging paperwork. It was, instead, an almost startlingly complete and carefully organized system, dozens of labeled binders and notebooks spanning more than 3 decades, each one indexed by property, by client, by year, and cross-referenced by the type of decision or dispute involved. Every major contract amendment was accompanied by a written explanation of the circumstances that had produced it. Every unusual exception granted to a tenant included a note explaining exactly why the exception had been made and what risk it had been designed to prevent from happening again. Every significant operational mistake the company had made over the decades was documented alongside the specific lesson learned from it, written in Clarence's careful, patient handwriting, entry after entry, year after year, an entire shadow archive of institutional memory that had existed the whole time, quietly, in the background, never once officially requested, and therefore never once fully appreciated. The room of executives, who gathered to examine the boxes, fell into a long, uncomfortable silence as the scale of what they were looking at slowly became clear to them. Victoria stood over one of the open binders for a long time that afternoon, turning pages that documented decisions stretching back to a version of the company that existed years before she had ever heard its name, and something in her understanding of the situation began, slowly and reluctantly, to shift. This was not sentimentality. It was not nostalgia for an older, slower way of doing business. It was, unmistakably, a functioning system, one that had been quietly protecting the company from exactly the kind of crisis it now found itself facing, and it had been dismantled, not because it had failed, but because nobody still working at Sterling Crest had fully understood what it was. They were dismantling until it was already gone. One of the younger executives in the room that afternoon, a man who had joined Sterling Crest around the same time as Victoria, and who had been among the most enthusiastic supporters of the original digitization plan, admitted quietly to a colleague afterward that he felt a genuine sense of shame walking past those binders, not because anyone had done anything malicious, but because it had simply never occurred to him, in all the months of planning meetings and software demonstrations, to ask a single question about what specifically would be lost if the company stopped relying on Clarence's memory. He said that it was a strange, humbling thing to realize that an entire leadership team could spend months designing a more efficient future without ever once pausing to properly inventory what the past actually contained, and that the experience left him determined never again to mistake the absence of visible complaint for the absence of real risk. The board, faced with a client relationship worth tens of millions of dollars hanging in the balance and a legal dispute that could not be resolved without the specific historical context only Clarence possessed, made the decision quickly and without much internal debate. They asked Victoria to reach out to him directly, not as a courtesy, not as an apology, but as an urgent operational necessity, and Victoria, setting aside whatever discomfort the request might have caused her, placed the call herself that same evening. Clarence answered on the third ring, his voice calm and unhurried, as it had always been. And when Victoria explained the situation, the dispute with the client, the missing context behind the water damage amendment, the board's growing anxiety, he listened, without interrupting, and without any trace of satisfaction in his voice, the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a man who has never needed to be proven right to know that he was. He agreed to come in the following morning. When Clarence walked back into the Sterling Crest offices, for the first time in over a year, the building felt both familiar and strange to him, the same marble floors and the same elevators, but filled now with faces that had grown slightly less certain of themselves since he had last seen them. Several longtime colleagues stopped in the hallway when they saw him, some offering an awkward apology they had clearly been carrying for months, others simply shaking his hand a little longer than necessary, unable to find the right words for the discomfort they felt at having let his departure pass without objection. Clarence accepted each gesture with the same quiet grace he had always carried, offering no blame, no lecture, no reminder of what he had once tried to warn them about. He had not returned to make anyone feel foolish. He had returned because a problem existed that he could help solve, and solving problems had always been the thing he understood how to do best. Over the following days, Clarence worked closely with the legal team to reconstruct the full history behind the disputed amendment, pulling from his old records the original engineering assessment, the specific concessions negotiated with the client 12 years earlier, and the reasoning behind language that had appeared, to a modern reader stripped of context, almost arbitrary. Armed with that reconstructed history, Sterling Crest's legal team was able to present the client with a clear, well-documented account of the original agreement, resolving the dispute favorably and, more importantly, restoring the client's confidence in the company's ability to manage its own affairs with the seriousness such a relationship required. The immediate crisis passed within a matter of weeks, but Clarence's presence in the building did not end there, because the board, having glimpsed what his records actually contained, insisted that he stay on in some capacity, however temporary, to help the company untangle the other quiet failures that had begun accumulating since his departure. Danielle Reyes, in particular, had spent that stretch of weeks quietly wrestling with a private crisis of her own confidence, one she did not share openly with anyone else in the office. She had taken the operations coordinator role with genuine enthusiasm, certain that her fluency with the company's new systems represented exactly the kind of forward motion Sterling Crest needed, and the string of failures that followed Clarence's departure. The tenant dispute, the missing disclosure, Harold's payroll error, the widow's eviction notice, had left her wondering whether she had simply been unprepared for a job that turned out to require far more than technical skill. She had lain awake more than one night, replaying the eviction notice in her mind, imagining the widow's daughter on the phone, her voice breaking, and wondering whether she had failed not because the software had misled her, but because she had trusted the software, more than she had trusted her own instinct, to ask why an elderly woman with 30 years of perfect payment history would suddenly and inexplicably fall behind. When Clarence returned to help untangle the mess, Danielle approached him not with resentment, but with something closer to relief, grateful for a chance to learn. Finally, the parts of the job that no training manual had ever thought to teach her. He helped resolve the confusion around Harold Jennings's payroll discrepancy within a single afternoon, producing the original documentation of the private compensation arrangement, and ensuring the 20-year employee was not only spared any repayment, but formally and sincerely apologized to by a company that had nearly punished him for an act of quiet fairness performed on his behalf years earlier. He helped the development team locate a copy of the missing environmental disclosure, which had never actually been lost, but had simply been filed under an old zoning designation the digitization team had not thought to search, saving the mixed-use project from a costly and unnecessary delay. He spent long afternoons walking newer employees through the reasoning behind processes they had been taught to follow, without ever understanding why, patiently explaining that a particular approval requiring 3 separate signatures existed because of a fraudulent lease applications discovered in the late 1990s, and that a certain maintenance inspection protocol existed because of a near miss involving a faulty elevator cable that could have cost someone their life had it gone unnoticed. Single day longer, Danielle Reyes, more than anyone else at the company, found herself changed by the weeks she spent working alongside him. She had come to Sterling Crest confident in her own abilities, fluent in every piece of software the company used, and privately, quietly certain that much of what the older staff had once done by hand was simply inefficiency dressed up as tradition. Sitting across from Clarence one afternoon, as he walked her through the reconstructed history of the widow's rent adjustment, she asked him, somewhat sheepishly, how he had managed to remember details like that for so many different tenants, across so many different years, without ever once writing a formal policy about it. He told her that the honest answer was that he had never thought of it as remembering rules, only as remembering people, and that once a person understood the specific human reason behind an exception, the exception tended to stay lodged in the mind in a way that a spreadsheet entry never quite could. He showed her, that afternoon, how he had organized his notebooks not by category or date, but by the story each decision told, so that flipping through them felt less like reading a manual and more like listening to 36 years of a single long conversation about the same company. Danielle left that meeting and, without being asked, began keeping her own notebook that same week, a small act that would later become the seed of the very mentorship structure the company eventually built around him. She filled the first several pages that week alone, writing down not just the facts of each case she handled, but the reasoning behind every judgment call, the small human context that no drop-down menu in the company's software had ever been designed to capture, and within a month, the habit had spread quietly to 2 other members of her team, neither of whom she had specifically asked to adopt it, simply because they had noticed how much steadier her decisions had become since she started. It was during one of these long afternoons, sitting across from Danielle Reyes, as she reviewed a stack of his old files, with something between admiration and quiet embarrassment, that Clarence offered his own honest reflection on what had happened, an admission that surprised her in its candor. He told her that for many years he had believed it was enough simply to do his job well, to carry the knowledge quietly and use it responsibly whenever it was needed, without stopping to consider what would happen to that knowledge once he was no longer there to carry it. He said that this had been his own mistake as much as anyone else's, that he should have spent more of his later years teaching, rather than simply writing, not just for his own reference, but for the people who would eventually need to stand where he had stood. It was not an admission offered out of guilt or self-reproach, but a simple, clear-eyed acknowledgement of a responsibility he had not fully honored. And in offering it so plainly, Clarence became, in the eyes of many who heard him say it, not merely a man who had been proven right, but a man capable of genuine humility, even in the moment of his vindication. Victoria watched this unfold from a careful distance for several weeks, observing the quiet, steady way Clarence worked, the way people who had once dismissed him now sought him out, the way problems that had seemed intractable a month earlier dissolved almost effortlessly, once the right context was applied to them. She found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, replaying the conversation from over a year earlier, in which she had told him the company needed people who built the future rather than people who guarded the past, and she began to understand, with a discomfort she did not try to avoid, how incomplete that framing had been. She had not been wrong that Sterling Crest needed modernization. The client dashboards, the faster reporting, the streamlined communication, all of it had genuine value, and she did not regret pursuing any of it. What she had failed to understand was that innovation built on top of erased history is not really progress at all, but simply speed in a direction nobody has properly examined, and that the fastest way to repeat an old mistake is to forget entirely that the mistake was ever made. She thought back, during those quiet weeks of reckoning, to the technology companies she had transformed earlier in her career, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider a distinction she had never previously drawn between them and Sterling Crest. Those earlier companies had been young, built from scratch around software and iteration, with little accumulated history to lose in the first place, and the speed she had brought to them had been, in a genuine sense, exactly what they needed. Sterling Crest was a different kind of organism entirely. A company whose entire value proposition to its clients rested on decades of trust, on relationships maintained across multiple business cycles, on the kind of long institutional memory that could not be rebuilt quickly, no matter how sophisticated the replacement software happened to be. She had walked into Sterling Crest, applying a playbook written for a different kind of company, and it had taken watching that playbook nearly cost the organization its largest client before she was willing to admit, honestly and without excuse, that not every business problem responded to the same solution, and that wisdom earned through decades of specific, hard-won experience was its own kind of infrastructure, every bit as real and every bit as essential as the servers running the company's new software. She asked Clarence to meet with her privately one afternoon in the same office, where she had once told him the company no longer needed him, and this time she was the one who spoke first, admitting plainly that she had believed she was clearing away the things slowing the company down, without ever recognizing that some of what she cleared away had been the very thing holding the company steady. Clarence listened to her the way he listened to everyone, without interruption, without triumph, and when she finished, he told her, simply, that younger people bring speed to an organization, and people with experience bring direction, and that a company genuinely built to last needs both in equal measure, neither one able to fully replace the other. Victoria nodded slowly, sat with the weight of that for a long moment, and then asked him whether he would consider returning to Sterling Crest, not in his old role, but in a newly created position as a senior operations advisor, someone whose responsibility would be, at least in part, to ensure the company never again lost this much of itself without realizing what it was losing. Clarence did not answer immediately. He thought about the 36 years he had already given the company, about the quiet dignity of the exit he had once accepted without complaint, about whether returning now might look, to some, like a kind of vindication he had never particularly sought. But he thought too about Harold Jennings, and about Danielle Reyes, and about the shelves of binders that held decades of hard-won lessons that would mean nothing if nobody remained who could explain them. And he told Victoria, finally, that he would return, not out of any need to be proven right, but because he still believed, as he always had, that the company was worth protecting. In the months that followed, Sterling Crest built something new out of the lesson it had nearly learned too late, a formal mentorship program, pairing its newest, most technically capable employees with its longest tenured staff, an arrangement designed explicitly to ensure that institutional knowledge would never again exist solely inside the memory of a single person, no matter how reliable that person had always proven to be. Younger employees taught their older colleagues the software that would carry the company into the coming decades, while Clarence and a handful of others like him spent their afternoons documenting not just the conclusions of past decisions, but the full reasoning behind them, building, deliberately this time, the kind of written record that could survive any one person's departure. The employees who had once viewed Clarence as a relic of an outdated era found themselves, gradually and without much fanfare, seeking him out again, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for a way of thinking about the business that no dashboard could fully replace. The board, 6 months after the mentorship program launched, invited Clarence to speak briefly at its quarterly meeting, an invitation that would have been unthinkable to nearly everyone in the building only a year earlier. He stood at the front of the same room where his own position had once been eliminated with barely a moment of debate, and he told the assembled directors, in the same calm, unhurried voice he had always used, that a company's greatest asset was rarely visible on any balance sheet, that the true value of an organization like Sterling Crest lived in the thousands of small, specific judgments made correctly over many years by people who understood not just what the rules said, but why the rules existed in the first place. He told them that software could execute a decision brilliantly once that decision had already been made correctly, but that no algorithm could yet replace the quiet, accumulated wisdom of a person who had watched an organization succeed and fail and succeed again over decades, and that the healthiest companies, in his experience, were the ones that found a way to let their newest ideas and their oldest lessons work side by side, rather than treating one as an enemy of the other. He offered them a simple image before he sat back down, telling the board that a company was something like an old house that had been added onto many times over the years, and that a good renovation studied the original foundation carefully before deciding what to keep and what to rebuild, while a careless one simply tore out walls without ever asking what they had been holding up in the first place. And that Sterling Crest, in his view, had come dangerously close to being the second kind of renovation, before it managed, at the last possible moment, to become the first. Several board members later admitted privately that it was the clearest and most useful presentation the board had received in years, delivered by a man who held no formal seat in the room and had never once asked for one. One afternoon, months into this new arrangement, a young analyst who had joined the company only recently and who had heard the story of Clarence's departure and return second-hand, asked him directly whether he had ever felt anger toward the company for what had happened to him. Clarence considered the question for a moment, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an easy answer, and told her that he had not felt anger, not really, only a quiet sadness at the thought that 36 years of lessons might simply have disappeared. The day he walked out the door, lessons that had cost the company real money and real people, real hardship, to learn in the first place. He told her that what mattered to him now was not whether anyone remembered his name in the years ahead, but whether the mistakes documented in those old binders stayed remembered long enough that nobody at Sterling Crest ever had to learn them the hard way twice. That evening, Clarence went home and told his wife about the conversation, and she asked him, the way she often did, whether he ever regretted staying at one company for so many years instead of pursuing something with a bigger title or a more impressive salary along the way. He thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about most things, and told her that he did not, that there was a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a place grow up around you, in knowing every scar on a building's history and every reason behind every strange rule, a satisfaction that could not easily be replaced by moving from company to company, chasing a taller title. His wife, who had watched him leave for that same office every morning for 36 years, smiled and told him that Sterling Crest had been lucky to have him for as long as it did, luckier still that it had eventually figured that out before it was too late to matter. In the final stretch of that year, as Clarence walked through the newly renovated Sterling Crest offices, past younger employees bent over dashboards that now included, quietly embedded within them, small annotated notes explaining the history behind unusual clauses and exceptions. He no longer thought of himself primarily as the keeper of old records. He had become instead something closer to a bridge, a patient, steady presence, helping an entire new generation understand not just what decisions the company had made over the decades, but why those decisions had ever made sense in the first place, and why understanding the why mattered every bit as much as knowing the what. On his last afternoon as a full-time advisor, before easing into a lighter, part-time arrangement that would let him spend more time with his grandchildren, Clarence cleaned out the small desk the company had given him upon his return. A desk far smaller than the corner office he had occupied for 36 years, but one he had come, in its own way, to appreciate for what it represented. He found, tucked into the back of a drawer, the same employee badge he had carried out of the building on that gray Tuesday, the one that had sat quietly in a box in his closet for over a year, and he turned it over once in his hand, before setting it gently beside the small brass nameplate the company had recently made for him. One that reads Senior Operations Advisor in simple, unadorned letters. He did not need the recognition, had never particularly wanted it, but he allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel something quietly close to pride, not in having been proven right, but in having spent 36 years building something that had ultimately proven strong enough to survive even the mistake of losing him. Experience, in the end, is not the thing that stands in the way of the future. It is the thing that keeps the future from repeating the very mistakes the past already paid, often at great cost, to learn. Clarence Whitmore did not win because Victoria Hale failed as a leader, and he never once framed it that way to anyone who asked. He won, quietly and without any real fanfare, because in the end, an entire company finally saw clearly the value he had carried with him, unnoticed, through every single one of those 36 years, and because, in the end, they chose not to let that value walk out the door a second time. Years later, long after Victoria Hale had gone on to lead an even larger company, and long after Danielle Reyes had risen into a senior leadership role of her own, employees who never had the chance to meet Clarence Whitmore in person would still occasionally hear his name mentioned in passing, usually in the context of some old clause or unusual exception buried in a decades-old contract. The story of the reasoning behind it, passed down now not through memory alone but through the careful written record he and Danielle had built together in his final years at the company. The mentorship program he helped establish continued long after his formal advisory role ended, quietly ensuring that the specific kind of knowledge he had once carried alone would never again depend on the survival or convenience of any single person. And somewhere in a storage room at Sterling Crest, no longer forgotten and no longer nearly discarded, the original binders remained, carefully preserved now under a small brass plaque bearing his name, not as a monument to a man who had once been pushed aside, but as a quiet, permanent reminder that the fastest way toward the future is rarely the one that requires forgetting everything it took to survive the past.